What's up guys, Thomas from FT86SpeedFactory, and today we talk about turbos, not turbocharge your FRS BRZ or 86. Now this video is going to be just about turbochargers, but the alternative for forced induction is going to be a supercharger, and we could make a video just on superchargers. Let me know if you guys want that in the comment section down below. But a supercharger takes energy from the crankshaft, from the engine, so it's robbing power from the engine in order to make boost to eventually make more power for the engine. And you're always going to be at a disadvantage from that parasitic draw from the engine, but with the supercharger you do get direct boost as soon as you hit the throttle. Now turbochargers are more efficient. They don't take any power away from the engine in order to make boost. Instead, they use the wasted flow of the exhaust gas to spin a turbine, and that turbine spins a compressor, and that compressor makes boost to make you more power. But that whole process takes a bit of time, so you're always going to have an inherent amount of lag with a turbocharger. It's never going to be the same as the instant power you get with a supercharger. Now the supporting mods for a supercharger and turbocharger are going to be pretty similar, but we're talking about turbos now, so let's go ahead and get into all the parts that you need for it. I got the grocery list right here, and the first one is going to be a turbo. That one's kind of obvious. Next one's going to be a turbo manifold, and that's what's used to connect the turbo to the engine. It's basically just a exhaust header with a turbo flange on the end. Now to regulate how much pressure, how much boost the turbo is making, you're going to need a wastegate, and some turbos have internal wastegates while others require an external wastegate, and that external wastegate will just bolt onto the turbo manifold. Now to regulate the wastegate, you're going to need a boost controller, and you're also going to need a blow-off valve, and that's used to make really cool noises when you let off the throttle, but it also evacuates all the excess charged air inside the system when you let off the throttle. Now intercoolers are up next. They aren't required, but they are recommended, and it lowers your intake air temperatures. Now with all this extra air, you're gonna need some extra fuel as well, and that means a new fuel pump and new injectors, but it also depends on how much power you plan on making, because the stock fuel system can go quite a ways with low amounts of boost, but we'll talk about that later. Now next you're gonna need a new map sensor to handle the extra boost, and then you're also gonna need a tune so your ECU knows what the heck to do with all this extra fuel and air. Now first, let's talk about the stock FA20 engine. Now the stock engine has a compression ratio of 12.5 to 1, which is pretty high for a naturally aspirated engine. You want something typically a little bit lower, around the 8 to 1 or 9 to 1 ratio. However, the internals on these engines can handle a bit of power, but once you start pushing it around the 350 wheel horsepower area, that's when things get kind of sketchy. You start rolling the dice in terms of reliability, so it's a good idea if you start making that much power, throw some forged internals inside here before you go ahead and put a window in the block. Since these engines have a modern fuel system combining both port and direct injection, you can safely handle about 250 horsepower. However, some tuners have been able to crank that up to 300 horsepower on the stock fuel system. But if you want to lean towards the side of safety, you'll upgrade the fuel pump and the injectors to make sure your engine doesn't run too lean, because if it runs too lean, it gets hot, parts fail, and then your engine grenades on itself. So make sure you're giving enough fuel to your engine. Now let's dive into the core components of a turbocharger system, starting with the turbo. Now inside each turbo you're going to have some bearings, and those bearings need to stay lubricated, and typically you're going to be using the same oil that's in your engine to make sure that they're lubricated. That oil is also going to dissipate some heat in those bearings, and the way to get the engine oil from your engine to your turbo is by tapping in some lines and fittings into your oil pan. That is of course going to require some modifications to your oil pan, and if you don't want to do that, there are already ones that are modified that already have the fittings in there, and some of those are going to be available separately, or I think you can get them as an optional extra from the full-blown premium turbo kit. Now as far as bearings go, you have two different options. You have ball bearings and you have journal bearings. Now journal bearings are going to be your more conventional old school bearing type. They aren't very expensive and they get the job done, however they're not very efficient. Now ball bearings are going to be way more expensive, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 times the cost of a journal bearing version turbo, but they're way more efficient and they're going to flow a lot more air. A ball bearing is going to flow a lot more air than a larger journal bearing. But generally speaking, in a very simplified form, a smaller turbo is going to make power sooner. It's going to spool up faster, meaning less lag, but it's also going to run out of breath faster, while a larger turbo is going to take a while to spool. Once it's spooled up, it's going to make more power. Obviously, the turbo is one of the most important parts of the turbo kit. Things like the turbo size, the bearing types, and if it's water cooled are going to play a huge component in the efficiency, the power band, and of course the price. Those extra features are going to jack the price up a little bit. But the things that you need to do, you need to take the time and the research to decide what turbo you need for your style of driving and your power goals. Now the next section we're going to be talking about is fuel, and since the turbo is shoving more air into the engine, we need to match that with more fuel, and the way to do that is by upgrading the injectors and the fuel pump. The fuel pump is located inside the gas tank, but it can be easily accessed by removing the rear seat and the driver's side and lifting up and prying open that access panel. I did a whole video on this that shows you step by step, and I'll link it up right here. As for the fuel injectors, those sit inside a fuel rail, and there's a fuel rail on both the left and right side of the engine. Those are located underneath this panel right here. And as far as size or flow rates go for the fuel injectors or the fuel pump, those greatly depend on the amount of power you plan on making. So far, we've increased the amount of air and fuel to the engine, and now we need a way to figure out how to tell the ECU how to deal with all this extra stuff. One of the more popular tuning options for turbocharging your car is to go with EcuTech, and this requires a license and a cable, and both of those can be bought together from our website. Now with one of these, you can go to your local dyno and have them tune and dial in your car, or if you don't have one of those local to you, you can always buy one of our tunes, and our local tuner will send you a base map, you'll do some data logging, send that information to him, you'll work back and forth until the tune is perfect. It's also possible to get a custom tune for an OFT if you already have an open flash tablet for your car. And the last way to tune your turbo setup is by going with a tune that's provided in a turbo kit. Not all turbo kits come with tunes, but the ones like from Full Blown do, and they'll email you the tune once you've purchased the kit, but you're gonna need to buy or borrow an EcuTech cable in order to install the tune to your car. Now there's one more component that you're gonna have to upgrade for your ECU to run properly, and that's a upgraded map sensor. Now a map sensor measures the manifold absolute pressure, and the stock one can't handle boost, so it's not gonna be able to read the amount of air pressure in your manifold, so you're gonna have to get one, and the aftermarket ones typically are configured in a 3-bar or 4-bar configuration, and the one that you get depends on how much boost you plan on running. Now engine cooling is up next, and it's especially a very important part for forced induction cars, because when you're adding a turbocharger, you're adding more fuel and air, and that's more work on the engine, and as a byproduct of that, the engine runs hotter, so you need to upgrade your cooling system to make sure your temperature stays at a safe range, and that's going to increase reliability and longevity, and overall it keeps your engine from exploding or catching fire. Now, there are 3 basic ways to keep your engine cool. You can cool the engine's fluids, you can cool the air-fuel mixture, and you can also do things to keep the engine bay temperatures down. For the fluid in the engine, you can install a bigger, more efficient radiator to keep those engine coolants down, and you can also install an oil cooler that's going to keep your oil temps down. You can also lower your cylinder temperatures by changing some things to your air and fuel mixture. You can install an intercooler that are going to lower the charged air temps. That's going to help reduce your chances against detonation, but intercoolers add a bit of restriction to the airflow, so you're always going to have a small pressure drop with them. Now on the fuel side, running a richer mixture is going to run cooler, but if you want a greater cooling effect with your fuel, you should consider running 85. However, that does require 30% more fuel, so you need to keep that in consideration when you're upgrading your fuel system. And the last way to keep your engine cool, which is reducing the engine bay temperatures, you can do things like installing a turbo blanket, which is basically a fancy heat shield for your turbo, since turbos get frickin' hot, and usually they're in pretty close proximity to the intake, and reducing any heat expelling from the turbo can also reduce how hot the intake gets, because you don't want a hot intake. You want as cold as air as possible. But another thing you can do is get ceramic coated turbo manifolds, because that's going to keep all the heat in the exhaust, which makes the exhaust more efficient, but it also helps from expelling heat all over the engine bay. So if you have a stock FRS BRZ or 86 and you just want a little bit more power than stock, you should go with an aftermarket header and a tune. But if you want a lot more power, a significant increase, you should definitely go with forced induction, because that's really the only way you're going to meet those power goals. If you want over 200 horsepower, 250, 350 wheel horsepower, a turbo system is a great way to do that. If you have any questions about turboing your FA20, or you just want help picking out which kit is going to be right for you, you can send us an email at sales@FT86SpeedFactory.com. If you want to browse and check out all the turbo kits that we sell on our website, you can click right here or the link down in the description. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you hit that like button down below. This is Thomas, and I'll see you guys in the next video. To cool your engine, you can you can click right here or the description down in the link. Wow.